The clone army could have been the most successful venture that Palpatine had as a Sith. An army of identical genetically perfect soldiers bred for nothing but battle and obedience were the ideal tool to use against the Jedi Order. Not as a fighting force against them, but as infiltrators to gain their trust, and to shoot them in the back when Order 66 arrived. And after this, Palpatine would instantly have a battle-trained veteran army with which to build the Stormtrooper Corps. But as we full well know, this wouldn't last for more than about 10 years in Legends continuity. Eventually, Palpatine chose to scrap cloning altogether and go with naturally born recruits for the Empire. And from this point forward, Palpatine never looked back, and completely swore off using cloned armies altogether. The reasons were pretty understandable, with the accelerated aging being one of the biggest factors, but it seems odd that Palpatine wouldn't just try again with new clones in the future, especially after the recruits of the Stormtrooper Corps proved to be far inferior to the former Grand Army of the Republic. We want to know why Palpatine left cloning behind altogether, but before we get into the briefing, our corporals have informed us that some unlisted soldiers have been wearing our armor. If you enjoy receiving updates and insights on the lore from a galaxy far, far away, then open fire on the subscribe button to join our legion today. Now, let's find out why Palpatine swore he would never use the clones again. The important thing to note when discussing the topic at hand in Legends is the inhibitor chips do not exist. The clones were not put under mind control of sorts to kill the nearest Jedi when Order 66 was initiated. Each squad commander was briefed on the various clone contingency orders beforehand. Each clone was indoctrinated to obey orders, and to hold loyalty to the Republic above all else. So when it was said that the Jedi had attempted to assassinate the Chancellor, all of the clones turned on the Jedi generals without question. Well, almost all of them. There was a small number of clones that did question the Order, as they had developed extremely close bonds to their Jedi commanders. In fact, the very first mission of Darth Vader's entire career was to travel to the world of Martynas, where the small group of clone troopers had been located. A small group that had not only disobeyed Order 66, but actually aided the Jedi in their escape. This right here was the first red flag in the Emperor's mind about the continual usefulness of the clone troopers after this single mistake. When the large majority of the clones were bred with nothing but loyalty in mind, it troubled Palpatine a great deal that a few clones managed to resist their own genetic engineering. But things were about to get much worse. After Vader dealt with this incident, the desertions did not stop here. There would be an uprising of clones who felt dirty about betraying their Jedi leaders. Many were furious about the lack of information or sense surrounding the supposed Jedi insurrection. And almost all of the elitely bred clone troopers would end up totally abandoning the Imperial Army. This included half of the commandos, as well as Null-class ARC troopers, and a good amount of the regular ARCs. But for Palpatine, this was expected. The ARCs had always been much more independent than regular clones, and were dangerous because of it. In order to ensure that no more troopers followed their example though, he ordered all that was left of the Grand Army to swear allegiance to the Empire. Those that accepted got to remain in active duty, to have their purpose fulfilled. Those that refused were branded as deserters, traitors. These clones were hunted down and executed en masse. This period of desertion left a bad taste in the Emperor's mouth, prompting him to keep a close eye on what remained of the clone Stormtrooper Corps. They were wildly successful in many of their early ventures and missions though. Being combat veterans by this point, the clones were efficient and strong, deadly. But they were getting older, and as the years wore on, the Stormtrooper Corps wore down as well. Palpatine began arranging for replacements to be made with the Kaminoans, but as soon as this happened, the Kamino uprising would take place. The event would mark a significant turn in the history of the Jango Fett clones. In the years following the rise of the Empire, Kamino was kept under the watchful eye of Palpatine and the Empire. He wanted to ensure that the planet's cloning technology remained under his sole control. Resentful of this, a small group of Kaminoans began to grow a secret army of clones in order to fight against their oppressor. This secret batch was labeled as the Clone Anti-Imperial Troopers, and distinguished themselves with Phase 1 armor. This was the first time that the Empire enlisted the help of Boba Fett, since he knew all of the secret entryways onto Poca City, which of course was on Kamino. Boba would lead the 501st Legion to shut down the clone uprising and to execute the Kaminoan rebels. This single incident convinced Palpatine that it was time to commission new clones from a different genetic template, several, and the DNA of Jango Fett had been stretched so thin that it was not producing the soldiers like that of old. Palpatine also allowed the recruitment of naturally born soldiers to fill in the ranks of the Stormtroopers, but they had to come close to the strict height, weight, and muscle mass requirements that the clone troopers did. But Palpatine also did this because he believed that the clones were too susceptible to corruption innately. Even though the clones were far superior as soldiers, they were a blank slate. Their whole purpose was to be susceptible to indoctrination. But while this was an advantage to Palpatine before, this quickly proved to be a disadvantage when they were corrupted. If a single domino falls, then the trooper could cause a chain reaction, and the rest of his genetically identical brothers would follow. And so Palpatine believed that diversifying the army would solve this problem. The other clones that he would go on to use were not used for different genetic templates, but he used completely different cloning methods as well. Instead of having them all grow up in a Kaminoan lab, he returned them to the Kamite species of the planet of Kartau, who produced clones using a method known as the Sparti cylinders. These unique cylinders allowed the Empire to grow clones within only a year, 10 times faster than that of the Kaminoans. The Sparti clones had their minds formed from the process known as a flash memory. This involves writing the memories of another trooper to the fresh one's clone brain. The memories of the trooper used was that of an exceptionally loyal, disciplined, and a skilled warrior. So they had clones from a variety of templates now, all being produced within a single year, and sharing the memories of only one or a few of the actual troopers. Not only was this quicker, it was cheaper too. At this point, Palpatine was trying to get the Death Star up and running, and now that he was the Emperor, cost efficiency was at the forefront of his mind. Rather impressive, but also extremely problematic. Although this provided the Empire with a fast and a cheap solution to the problem of declining troop numbers, it brought with it a large number of other problems. Clones grown in the Sparti cylinders were notoriously unstable, and any clones that are incubated and grown in less than a year would inevitably go insane. This was the baseline. Insanity was always the endgame. There was a reason why the Kaminoans took their time and capped off the acceleration at just 10 years. Not to mention that flash memory in this process can be done imperfectly, and when this occurs, it results in brain damage. And unfortunately, this occurred extremely often. Even when it was successful, the final results are far inferior to the Kaminoan method of combat training. One can have the mental memories, but if you don't have the muscle memory of real training, then the mind can only take them so far. While they numbered in the billions at one point, the Sparti clone troopers generally exhibited poor marksmanship and lacked battlefield tactics. They fired wildly in combat and didn't bother to take cover, causing them to be about as effective as a B-1 battle droid. Some even considered them to be worse. They were even known to refuse to follow orders at times and fire on their own allies because of clone madness. This infuriated the Emperor and led him to scrapping the Sparti clones altogether and focus purely on recruiting naturally born members from the Imperial public. The Empire did an excellent job at depicting the Jango Fett clones as war heroes, those who bravely protected their Emperor and the galaxy from the Jedi. He made it look as though their actions during the Clone Wars was because they were forced to follow the incompetence of Jedi orders, and by the time the Empire was about a decade old, the clones were seen as elite, veteran troopers serving as the nucleus of the Stormtrooper Corps. When recruiting officially opened, a remarkable number of young patriots all around the Empire volunteered to follow the example of the clone troopers. It was actually shocking how many youngsters grew up watching and admiring the clones on the HoloNet. Each one fed the carefully laid out propaganda that Palpatine had orchestrated, and they now wished to march under the proud banner that the clones had established, desiring to fight and to sacrifice on behalf of the Empire. You see, the difference between the clone troopers and the stormtroopers wasn't just a matter of indoctrination, but admiration as well. But despite how much fresh recruits looked up to the clone predecessors, these veterans did not feel the same way about the new guys. Fett clones like Commander Cody viewed the Stormtrooper Corps as an embarrassment to the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic. Their battlefield efficiency and marksmanship were definitely inferior, as was their physicality. But by now, all of the clones had been put into training roles or officer positions, where they were living out the rest of their rapidly decelerating life, serving Palpatine from the shadows, diminishing the role of the once proud warriors. Palpatine, though, couldn't have been more pleased with how the Stormtroopers turned out. Despite their lower overall effectiveness, they were no longer living in a time of war. What Palpatine needed soldiers for was occupation, oppression, and fear. Their loyalty and devotion to the Empire was the only thing that he needed from them, insurance that as a collective, they would not rise up against him. In many ways, the clone troopers were the next to go after the Jedi, the next biggest threat that Palpatine saw to his empire. If a stormtrooper expressed traitorous thoughts or feelings, he could infect his brothers. He'd either be too afraid to speak up, or he would get shut down by the morale of other loyal comrades. All in all, while clones were definitely better soldiers, they came with a host of physical and psychological issues as well that proved them to be a bad investment in the long run of the Empire. And the Sparti clones were frankly an embarrassment, those that would fire upon their own men in an act of pure madness. But that is why Palpatine decided that natural recruits were far better, and he swore off clone armies entirely from this point forward. But now we want to know your thoughts. Now that you've heard the full explanation, do you think it was a smart move that Palpatine had to switch to the naturally born enlistment soldiers? Or do you think that he should have found a better way to perfect the cloning process? As always, thank you so much for joining us here at the Archives each day, and may the Force be with you.